Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of the Nordic Pro podcast. How are we this evening? My name is, as per usual, Bobby Solistar, and I will be your host for tonight's podcast. With me on the line is the host and owner of the Wrestleville podcast, where wrestling happens, or where it all happens, Mr. Vinny Berry. I totally made a cock up about that one, didn't I?
It's where
So yeah,
wrestling lives.
where wrestling lives, that was it. Not where
But it,
wrestling happens.
but it happens. It happens to live there too.
Yeah, lovely. How are we? You right?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
Honestly, no worries, no worries. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to appear. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is obviously a crossover podcast. I'm pretty sure that you can tell by the title. Um, yeah, between us here at the Nordic Pro podcast and the Wrestleville podcast as well. Um, so, Vinny, sort of introduce yourself to the viewers. Uh, who are you, sort of thing? How did you first come across wrestling, and where did the Wrestleville podcast come from?
Well, I grew up in Texas, right? So I
Yep.
I moved to Texas about when I was 11 years old. I knew what wrestling was, but I didn't really ever get into it until
Mm.
I moved to the Dallas Fort Worth area in the Von Erichs. The
Yeah.
Von Erichs and World Class Championship Wrestling really caught my attention, and
Yeah.
so I've always liked that. That of course went away and it evolved and it became something else, and but I found myself after college kind of getting back into it again, and funny about how all the writing for the wrestling. Uh, in 2011, I moved to South Texas, and there was a lot of boxing and MMA going on. I met some guys that were writing for boxing and MMA, and I started doing that too. Did that for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, and then that kind of came to a halt. There was the boxing and MMA kind of dried up down here. Like the promotions left, and
Mm.
it just wasn't what it was when I was covering it. And I stopped writing for a while, and then I thought, you know what, I really miss writing. I want to start writing again, and so I started Wrestleville.com, and I started writing little stories about wrestlers, like little bios, and did that from about, I think, 2017 to 2021, and then I started the podcast.
Okay, nice. So, was the podcasting and like the writing something that you wanted to do for a while then, or?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing. Writing was something, it's like writing has just always been something, right?
Mm.
That it was that I like to do and that I did. However, I didn't do it enough really to, like even consider myself being half decent at it, right? But
Mm.
the more I did it, and the more I did the boxing, and I hundreds of stories, and then MMA, and then
Mm.
I can't tell you how many uh, wrestling stories that I've written since then. Probably uh, I don't know, maybe close to 200 or
Oh, wow.
150 or I mean quite a few,
Yeah.
and but I've written some books too, and right now I'm just concentrating on doing the podcast, and uh, I enjoy talking to wrestlers from around the world,
Mm.
and I also I'm writing. I have a friend of mine that has a website called the ProWrestlingWire.com,
Right.
and it's independent wrestling driven, right? It's really independent wrestling heavy, and
Mm.
so I write some stories. I'll put some of the stories, like little short stories that I write. And they're, when I say short stories, I'm talking 400 or 500 words, right? And
Mm.
we'll put those on there. Maybe I'll do like what happened on this day on there, and then he'll post my interviews on there as well. The ones that he gets. Yeah, I don't know how he picks my interviews, but some of the podcasts that I record, but he'll just pick the ones he likes and puts on there. So it helps get my product out there a little more to some
Yeah.
people that may not, you know. I'm kind of like well, crossover branding with him, right? Because people are finding that I'm out there because of his outlet that I'm using.
Yeah. So with the boxing and the MMA side of things like this, like is this something that you're still like involved with? Like
Yeah,
no?
I'm not doing that anymore. Matter of fact, I got to the point where I was writing, right? And then the last couple years of doing those sports, I got hired by a promoter to work exclusively for his company, right?
Yeah.
And do his website, write about, I wrote mainly about his wrestlers, but I also wrote about other people in the area. It was all MMA, mixed martial arts driven, right?
Mm.
And but then he I was helping his sister do the marketing, and then he brought me in as his matchmaker, which
Mm.
is it was trial by fire because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I did it for about a year and a half, and it was definitely challenging. Something I really enjoyed doing. However, I don't think I ever want to do that
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. So with the podcast then, like do you remember actually your first podcast?
again. Oh, I do.
And yeah, was that like a podcast, or was that like an interview podcast?
It was like an interview podcast. It was with
Yeah,
yeah, it was with Tokyo Monster Kahagas. He's
right.
the he was a former NWA World Heavyweight Champion, I think in 2011 or 2000, somewhere
Right.
around there. And the
Yeah,
yeah, somewhere around there.
yeah, fair enough. Like, did that go like well? If you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it went pretty well. My
Mm.
my very first podcasts were very short. Like
Mm.
like the very first ones were like I don't know, 17 minutes. I mean, I
Mm.
20 minutes. I mean, I was like
Yeah,
really wrapping it up quick. And then I got a little more comfortable doing it. And, I for me, I felt like I was pretty amazed by some of the wrestlers that I got on the show. Like, I interviewed Thunder Rosa, right? And
oh wow.
however, I don't know what happened to that recording. It's out in I don't know,
Oh,
Cyberville somewhere. I don't know. It's no
oh,
longer
flip.
on the podcast, but I did interview her. I was pretty stoked about that. I interviewed Sabu, Lindsay Dorado, Greg
Nice.
Gagne.
Yeah,
Um, let's see, Tim Storm, Greg
yeah,
Anthony. So uh, who else? Just Incredible, PJ
yes,
Black.
yeah,
Okay, so I've and quite a few, quite a few wrestlers that I was kind of surprised. I got an interview coming up here pretty soon with John Wayne Murdoch. I don't know if you know who that is, but
yes. He's a fairly well known like indie guy over your way, isn't he?
okay, yeah, yeah, and he does mostly deathmatch wrestling. He's
Yeah.
and I don't have a lot of those guys on my podcast. That's really not my style of wrestling.
Mm.
However, somebody likes it, and John is a great guy. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've, ever had the opportunity to talk to him or even listen to him on an interview,
Yeah.
but he's so down to earth. He's such a nice guy. And I was just really, really kind of trying to get into his head about, like, why do you do that? It's
Mm.
like,
Yeah.
but I don't even know if I answered my question, but that one's coming out in a few weeks. So You know,
Yeah.
I've got that, and let's see. I'm trying to think of maybe some more that I might have on there, but uh, the Maestro, Mario Mancini, Terry Morton, I was on there.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely an array of Sal Renardo. Do you know who Sal?
I can't say I do.
Okay, he's Sal the Pal in NWA.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's definitely uh, a vast variety. I have guys that retired, no longer wrestling. Some what I call old school wrestlers. Then I have a lot of new school wrestlers, and then I like to mix it up with some women. I like to mix it up with um, you know some deathmatch guys from time to time. I
Mm,
got Brad Cash on there, and just like I said, it's a mix. But all these interviews are conversations, and it's kind of I don't really work off questions. I get a couple bullet points off the wrestlers. A couple
mm,
things like I find out where they work, maybe how many years they've been doing it. I find a little tidbit of information about them, like the
mm,
one with uh, John Wayne Murdoch. He calls himself the Rabbit King. Well,
mm.
he has a pet rabbit.
Right.
And, so we were talking about his pet rabbit, and then one night I was talking to one gentleman, and we were talking about the uh, Rocky series, the movie franchise. So, you
Yeah.
know, you never know what's going to come up. One guy talked to me about donating his kidney, so it's like,
Nice.
yeah, so they're just conversations. They're just kind of fly by the seat of your pants kind of thing. But, you know,
Mm,
I think why the fans like them so much is they're not real long. I try not to go over 30, 35 minutes, and they they tell me that they feel like they walk away knowing a little bit about that person.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But yeah. Like that's the main thing. If they because obviously every wrestler is going to have somebody who wants to know more information about them. And podcasting's the best sort of way to express who they are. Them as a person, like how they first started out, and how they got to where they are today, and to your sort of podcast. Do you know what I mean? And yeah. So talk us through like your books that I'm aware that you've written as well. Like you've also written like a couple of books speaking about like the writing as well. What like have you released many of them, or is it just like a handful?
Sure, I have written 4 books. They've
Hmm.
all been released. In your country, you can get them on Amazon, but
Yep.
in the states, you can get them at Wrestleville.com. So if
Hmm.
you're listening to this in the United States, Wrestleville.com. Outside of the country, Amazon, right? And it would cost, I think, more to ship it to you than to right than to
Yeah.
buy it in on Amazon in your country. But my first book is Lance Von Erich, Lance by
Yep.
Chance, Wrestling as a Von Erich. It's about the fake Von Erich. Do you know anything about this guy at all? Anything?
I know a bit about each. Like I know a tiny bit about each individual Von Eric. Do you know what I mean? But
Okay,
yeah.
I'll give you the short version of this. So in 1984, David Von Erich died, right?
Yep.
And at that time, Kerry Von Erich and Kevin Von Erich were wrestling, and Mike
Hmm.
Von Erich was wrestling too, but he hadn't been wrestling very long,
Hmm.
right? He was uh didn't really want to be a wrestler, and he was probably the smallest of them, right? So um David Manning, Fritz Von Erich's right hand man and referee,
Hmm.
saw this guy, Lance Vaughn, uh, on on the actually his name is Kevin Vaughn, right?
Yep.
William Kevin Vaughn. Wasn't Lance, but he goes by Lance now because
Yep.
everybody calls him Lance. But he saw him on the golf course, and he looked like $1 million. And this was right after David died.
Mm.
But the thing is, he was a bodybuilder, but he didn't know how to wrestle. He didn't wrestle.
Mm.
And so they sent him up to Portland, and he trained, and he learned how, to wrestle. But when Mike Von Erich got sick, they kind of brought him down a little sooner than he felt comfortable coming down. A lot of
Mm.
people think that he was brought in to replace Mike because Mike was sick. Actually, they 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 probably would have threw this guy in the mix had he been ready at the time they found him,
Yeah.
right after David died, because they had this big old thing with the Freebirds, and they were making money on that feud.
Yeah.
And so that this is the story about him. It talks about, how he got into bodybuilding. It talks about how he got into wrestling. He never wanted to be a wrestler. Doesn't really like wrestling, but he ended up having a 10-year career, and most of it was international.
Mm.
That was
Nice.
my first book. My second book was Pro Wrestling, uh, the Pro Wrestling Vault Volume 1.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't happen to have one here at my desk, but I do have Volume 2. And these are the short stories that I was telling you that I was writing for my website.
Nice.
So
Yeah.
after Lance Von Erich, some of my friends were like, okay, what's your next book going to be? And this website basically went goodbye, right?
Yeah.
It ended up, I didn't keep it, and I started the podcast, but I had all these stories, and I didn't want the stories to go to waste, right? But I didn't want to put them in a book where it'd be 400 pages, right?
Mm.
So I split them up. I put 35 stories in one. There's about 46 stories in this one.
Yeah.
And I think what people are going to take away is they're going to be able to read these stories. They're probably 3 to 5 pages long,
Yeah.
right? And they have a lot of pictures in it, of the people who I wrote about. But you're gonna, like in this book, you're gonna know a little more about Kamala. You're gonna know a little bit about Bobby Eaton,
Yeah.
Scott Casey, Jeremiah Plunkett, and there's a young lady in here named Thea Hill. Well, in this book, she's called Nikita Knight, but she's Thea Hill in NXT.
Yep.
And I interviewed her 1 month after she started.
Oh
And
wow.
yeah,
Nice.
and now she's probably been in wrestling a couple years now. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting how all that came about. But, and she talks about her gymnastic career. She talks about her cheerleading career. And when all that went away, she told her dad, was like, "Hey, this is what I'm going to do now." And he was like, "Well, it's pro wrestling. You got to be kidding, right?" She goes, "No, this is what
Yeah.
I'm going to do. I'm going to." And she's so competitive, right? She fit right into it. So,
Mm.
but these are the stories you're going to get. And this, one of the thing is, as I like about this is, you could read one or two stories, put it down, come back to it, right? And
Yeah.
then read a couple more stories, or it's really good on a plane trip, right? Because you can,
Mm.
knock about, I don't know, 4 stories, 5 stories one time, whatever. And then my last book that I wrote was Russell Black Bart. It's the story of Black Bart. Are you familiar with Black Bart?
I am. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this talks about how he got into wrestling. Talks about his passion for wrestling. This guy, the thing I found very interesting about Bart was, most guys come in the business. They start at the bottom and they work their way up to the middle, and they get all the way up to the main event, and they pretty much stay there, or they
Mm.
stay in that area, right? And then they help other guys come up.
Mm.
Well, his career was a little different, where he started on the bottom and he got in the middle and he went back down to the bottom and he came back up a little bit and then he came up to the top and then he went back down to the middle and then he went back up to the top and he went back down to the bottom, and his career was really like a roller coaster. But what I really respected about this guy was, no matter where he was on the card, he didn't love pro wrestling any less.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this talks about, you know, it really goes into a lot of stories of the people that helped him, a lot of the territories that he worked in,
Mm.
and he even talks about what he's dealing with now, which he's dealing with stage 4 cancer. But the guy's been dealing with that for about 2 years now, and I talked to him the other day, and he's tough as nails, man. This is probably one of
Yeah.
the toughest guys. But he worked with Dusty Rhodes. He worked with Dusty Rhodes in Florida. He worked with Dusty Rhodes in the Carolinas. He worked with the Von Erichs. I mean, this guy, you know what? There's a story in here I think people will really, really enjoy. And it was mind blowing to me after I did the research. I just was really wow. But
Yeah.
he was working in Dallas, and this was in 80, what was it? 88? I believe it was 88. And he gets a call from Bruiser Brody, and he says, "Hey, man, I'm going to be here in Puerto Rico a little longer, and I got this match scheduled with Otto Vance in Austria. Do you know Otto
Yeah.
Vance? Okay.
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So he says, I need you to go over there and take care of this match for me. And, I already cleared it with Fritz. He knows you're going. I already cleared it with Otto. He knows you're coming. Call this number, and they're going to take care of you, blah, blah, blah." So he goes over there and he wrestles one match. And the guy gives him $3,000, right?
Oh
On,
wow.
on arrival. Rented a truck, gave him $3,000 on arrival, and put him up in a hotel or whatever. And, he got there and he had like a few days. They did some, they promoted the fight. They went to press conference, and the Otto's son took him about town, and he mingled with the community, tried to drum up business for the fight and whatnot. Took him to the place where he's gonna go, and he was really taken back because he wasn't used to having time off. Like he wrestled every night, every night, every
Yeah.
night, every night. He flew all the way out there, and he wrestles this one match, gets paid. But after the match, because he bled so much, he said he thought he maybe cut an artery or something, and he bled so bad, and Otto felt so bad for him that he gave him another $2,000 like a bonus, right?
Oh wow.
Well,
Yeah.
well, Bart was just so ecstatic about his performance over there and how the trip went, and so grateful for Bruiser Brody to send him over there. And so he gets back and he wrestles at the Sportatorium on a Friday.
Mm.
And that next Sunday, that following Sunday, was when Frank Bruiser Brody was stabbed in Puerto Rico and died.
Oh my god.
And so it was, and I had to do the research to match up the dates and everything. And I was, it always amazes me when I hear these stories. They tell me stories like this. Lance did it too. Lance would tell me these outrageous stories, and I'd go back and I'd do the research, and I'd dig up everything I can, and then I'd come out. It was like, damn, that really happened. It's like
Yeah.
you can't write
Yeah.
some of this. You can't make up some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But I knew about Bruiser Brody and how he passed, but I didn't know that he had gone out to Austria for him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And all
had he
that.
gone had he gone out to Austria, maybe that would have been different.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, but wow, yeah, jeez. But yeah, like, can fans of Wrestleville like expect to see many more books of yours to be published soon?
I don't have any projects per se. I've had a couple people reach out to me, and the last one that I thought was, was a project I thought I was going to work on. It ended up not panning out, and I was okay with that. you know, I wrote 4 books in a matter of about 5 years, and
Mm.
it really, you know, it really did take up a lot of time. It's like it really is like being married, to that project, and I just did one book after another and after another, and
Yeah.
it got to the point where now I'm basically marketing them. I do go out to some shows here in my state from time to time, um,
Mm.
but I'm kind of focusing on building up the podcast, and but I am keeping my writing tools sharp by writing some short stories for the ProWrestlingWire.com, and I'm doing that. And I think it's
Yeah.
important just to write, right? So when I do these interviews and I post
Mm.
them on my website, then I'll listen to them and I'll write a little story out of it, right? I
Yeah.
just kind of and it's kind of interesting how um, it's it's just a portion of the podcast. It's not all of it, right? It's
Mm.
not the whole conversation, but I might I might talk a little bit about um, some of the guys that taught this person how to wrestle, and or I might talk about what they learned from a certain person, or maybe they went to a specific promotion and their career had never been the same again. So it's
Yeah.
just a little something about that I find interesting, and those stories aren't very long at all. I think, like I said, they're probably about 400 or 500 words, but it's just something
Mm.
to kind of keep my writing skills sharp and just kind of exercising that part of my brain.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like it's like with the podcast and like the interviews. Like you don't need to have a podcast that's 3 4 hours long, and like you don't need to be like with the books. Like you don't need to keep them as like Harry Potter, Prisoner of Azkaban sort of length, being like 600 700 pages worth. Do you know what I mean? And what have you. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, because like as long as you can sort of like get the gist of like the story or the wrestler or whatever, then that's all you really want at the end of the day, innit? Do you know what I mean? You know,
Right.
and yeah, and yeah. So,
Well, I,
but
and I and I was telling you about the podcast. I kind of like to keep my podcast short, about 30 minutes or
mm,
so, because I can listen, from where I live to where I work. I can
mm,
listen to one and almost finish it up, right?
yeah,
And then maybe on the way home I can get the last 10 minutes or something. But
yeah,
I kind of like it for that aspect is that it's not real long. And I noticed on the longer podcasts that I was following, I was like following Stone Cold and I was following Jericho for a long time.
mm,
And they're an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, sometimes an hour and a half. And I wasn't finishing those podcasts.
yeah,
And as much as I thought they were interesting, it was just um, I'd get halfway and then I'd see another one and I'd start it and I get about halfway and then I'd never finish the other one. You know what I mean? And then I had all
mm,
these half completed podcasts taking up all the space on my phone or something, and I was
yeah,
like, yeah, it's just not. It
yeah.
wasn't ideal for me.
Um, I'm a follower of Jim Cornette, right? And like I listen to the Jim Cornette Experience and the Drive Through on a regular basis. And about a year and a half ago, I think it was an episode of the Experience, and not the Experience, of the Drive Through. Sorry, was just over 6 hours long, right? And it's like that's near enough an entire day at school. You know what I mean? And what have you, and all that. It's like, how do you find the amount of content and all that to put into like a 6 hour episode? You know what I mean? You know, but yeah, I'm like, oh my god, do you know what I mean? But yeah, but yeah. So, what can the Wrestleville fans expect to see from yourself in the coming days, weeks, and months?
Well, you're definitely going to get podcasts from
Yeah,
wrestlers from around the world. I like reaching out to international wrestlers. I like to interview the international wrestlers. Like on my time off, I can get maybe 2 or 3 wrestlers in there.
mm,
I like mixing it up. I like my podcast for a couple reasons because of the variety, right? And
Mm.
that's what people tell me. They enjoy the variety, and so that's what I try. I do international wrestlers, I do independent wrestlers, I do people mainstream, I do retired old school wrestlers, and just
Yeah.
basically, I try to keep it in the mix and mix it up. I've told you also too. I have a couple deathmatch wrestlers on my podcast. I don't, that's you won't see me going to that type of a wrestling show.
Mm.
However, there's a lot of people that like that stuff,
Yeah.
and you know, some of the guys that I had on the show, uh, Paul Bronson, Eric Dillinger, Brad
Mm.
Cash, and coming up in the next few weeks will be John Wayne Murdoch. They're pretty popular over here in the States.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. So, would you like to add anything on to the end of today's podcast then?
Yeah, also too. I have a really interesting two-parter coming up with Princess
Mm.
Victoria. I don't know if
Yeah.
you know her, but she was
Yeah.
an Indian warrior. She wrestled for about 4 years. She broke her neck. She was one of she she worked with Moolah, and she's very opinionated. She has a very hard story. It's got a lot of like mature audience material
Mm.
in it. She pulls no strings, and like I said, there's no gray area with that woman. I mean, she's as honest can get, and she tells it like it is. And I'm putting that together, and that'll be out here in a couple weeks as well. But it's a part one and a part two. I think people
Mm.
are going to really really like that. And one thing that I was really surprised about that was, you know, I really did believe that her career was a lot longer than 4 to 5 years.
Mm. Yeah.
But to me, that says that you know she had an impact on the business, right? And
Yeah.
she had an impact on me, and I and
Yeah.
I and I liked how she worked. And Magnum TA, he was the same way. Terry Allen, he was only in
Mm.
the business 5 years, but you know his career was so larger than life, and what he did in that 5 years was
Yeah.
something else. But it was cut short because of the car accident, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, where can the listeners of the Nerdic Pro podcast, who probably would have never have heard of the Wrestleville podcast, where can they catch all the podcasts that you've done previously and the ones that you've got coming up?
you can go to my website, wrestleville.com, right? And you can also they're they're on several platforms: Spotify, iTunes, uh, Podchaser, iHeartRadio, and you can also get the books on Amazon. And so, yeah, I think you'll enjoy the interviews, and because, like I said, you can go down the list and you'll see you're going to come across some people that you recognize. You're going to come across some people that you didn't, but then you'll walk away feeling like, hey, now I know who that person is, right? And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I try to do with not only with the podcast, but with the short stories too. Is that I want the reader or the listener to walk away, you know, coming in not knowing who this person is, but then afterwards wanting to go find their matches.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Lovely. So, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of the Nerdic Pro podcast, my name has, as per usual, been Bobby Salastar, and with me on the line has been the host and owner of the Wrestleville podcast, where wrestling happens. Happens?
Happens
Lives?
to live.
Happens to live. Where wrestling happens to live. The Wrestleville podcast. Go check him out. I'm sure that you will be impressed with the quality of and the content of podcast that you can find over there. So Vinny, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Nerdic Pro podcast this evening. I did forget to mention that once I end the live stream, we'll go back to the lobby that we were in beforehand. And but before we went live. And so ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, my name is, as per usual, been Bobby effing Salastar. With me on the line has been Mr. Vinny Berry, and I shall be seeing you all later. Goodbye. Stream.